the official start, I suppose. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the RIAI and the IGBC Design for Performance training series. So there's 3 training sessions. This is the first one, as you're aware of. Just quick introduction of myself. My name is Liz O'Brien, and I'm chairing this morning's session. I'm also an architect and sustainable energy engineer, which I'm sure many of you are as well. So I'm delighted to be with you today as we explore how performance-led approaches are shaping the future of our built environment. So today's session is titled From Compliance to Performance, the Context for Change. And we'll be hearing from many leading experts on why this transition to performance-based design is essential and how it aligns, I suppose, to the evolving EU policy, the national climate goals and investment priorities, all really important topics of the day. So this is a CPD training forms, and this forms part of a wider research and education initiative delivered by the Irish Architects and the Irish Green Building Council, and it's all funded by Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, the RIAI. So it introduced participants to a new design for performance, what we call DFP, and that's a framework. And it's developed to help project teams embed whole life carbon, operational energy, water, and indoor environmental quality metrics from early design stages via a collaborative approach. And that collaborative approach is really important. So I suppose that one of the first questions is, would the recordings be made available afterwards? I do know all the PowerPoints and things will be sent out to you. I'm not 100% sure if the recordings are available. I'll check that with Ginlin and let you know later on. So without further ado, I suppose we're going to start the proceedings. But the first session today, we'll give you an overview of the project and the framework. And after a short break, we'll follow with the keynotes and the policy landscape, national implementation and green finance alignment. So there'll be time for discussion and for reflection with Q&A and live polling during the session. So first of all, a little bit of husbandry. Please use the Zoom questions and answers function to submit your questions throughout the session. We would, of course, try to address as many questions as possible, but considering there's actually 300 of you now signed up today, we may not obviously get through them all, but I will try my best to get everybody to answer the questions. So we're going to start the proceedings, and we're going to start with Kathryn Meghen, which I'm sure many of you know, CEO of the RIAI. She'll be setting the context for RIAI, IGBC, SEAI project. So Kathryn, I'll let you introduce. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much. And first of all, I'm obviously delighted to be welcoming everybody here on the first day of this training series, Design for Performance. As Liz mentioned, the training series is a joint project by the RIAI and the IGBC, and very generously funded by the SEAI. And the work you'll be hearing about today is actually the result of a 2-year joint research project. So I suppose, as we all know, the built environment is responsible for over 1/3 of global emissions. And if we're to meet our national and European climate obligations, we must make a significant shift in how we approach the design and delivery of our built environment. At the RIAI, supporting our members deal with climate change and mitigates its impacts insofar as possible is a core objective of our strategy. We are working across many areas to support members and also to advocate for changes needed to deliver the most sustainable buildings and places possible. We want to see all aspects of a project's performance considered in terms of building design and operation in a way that ensures sustainability targets are met in a coordinated, strategic manner, led through a considered project planning approach. And the Design for Performance project is a key pillar of this work. The project has been developed a series of guidance documents, which you will be hearing about, for all participants in the design and construction of our built environment. Design for Performance provides adaptable tracking templates for monitoring whole life carbon, energy consumption, water usage, indoor environmental quality, allowing for comprehensive assessments of these factors. And better data and tracking enables better joined-up decision-making in design, investment, procurement, and implementation, all of which are obviously important tools for a professional skill set. The initiative comes as Ireland and other EU member states prepare to implement whole-life carbon limits for buildings in line with the 2024 revisions to the EPBD. And this shift reflects growing EU recognition that operational energy use alone no longer tells the full story. And embodied carbon from material and construction now makes up a significant share of emissions and must be tackled head on. And we all know that tackling climate change cannot be done in silos. And we're very proud that the Design for Performance project, what it has delivered, as we believe it has the potential to be transformative by supporting a real collaborative culture. The new guidance supports the shift by enabling every stakeholder, architects, engineers, contractors and clients, to collaborate around measurable outcomes and shared responsibility. The framework and the training are free and open access, and we hope it will drive the kind of transdisciplinary thinking needed to deliver sustainable, resilient buildings that work for people and for the planet. As I mentioned, the project has been 2 years in development, and I can't thank all of the contributors because the list is extremely long, but I would like to mention, obviously, the IGBC team and the members of the RIAI, the executive team, but in particularly the RIAI Sustainability Task Force, who have prompted and driven the RIAI to get engaged in this project and many of the other projects that you might hear about today. We had a very strong steering committee, and I'll mention just some of the organisations. We had Marsh Ireland, the OGP, Engineers Ireland, SEAI obviously, SCSI, the Land Development Agency, OPW, Hibernia REITs, Scott Group, Dublin City Council, and a technical committee with Cosmos, BDP, TU Dublin, Helena McElmeal Architects, Energy Elephant, Scott Group, RKD, UCD, Coady Architects. And I would very much like to thank our technical and editorial reviewer, Judit Kimpian, who has put a huge amount of work into it. I hope I haven't missed anybody out, but thank you all so much for the contributions. And I hope you will find this 3-session course and all the materials that will follow both useful and inspiring. So thank you, and I'll hand back over to Liz.
Lovely. Thank you, Kathryn. That was great. So we're going to quickly move on because I'm conscious of time. The first guest speaker, I suppose, I'm sure many of you know, and Sinéad Hughes. Now, she will be doing an introduction to the project, to provide an overview, but a little quick of a bio for Sinéad. So Sinéad is an RIAI registered architect with 26 years of experience and is accredited in conservation at grade 3. She is current second vice president of the RIAI and represents Ireland on the Architects Council of Europe Women in Architecture Task Force. At IGBC, she leads many initiatives, including ENACT and the Building Renovation Passport pilot. Sinéad also worked on the BUSY 2030 Skills Roadmap for Climate Action, a key contributor to the Design for Performance framework. She brings deep expertise in sustainable construction, retrofitting, and sector-wide upskilling. A great bio there, Sinéad. So I'm going to let you continue and provide an overview, I suppose, of the framework.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you, Kathryn, for that thorough overview of the project. So I will give a brief overview today of the Design for Performance project. And then next week, I will proceed with a more detailed thorough kind of analysis of the specifics within it. So if there's any specific questions, they may well be addressed next week. So by way of an introduction, the project is essentially about building performance and making key decisions at the earliest stages in order to set targets and have a considered approach for focusing on tracking, monitoring, and improving those performance targets for the full life cycle of a project. By way of overview and introduction to the Irish Green Building Council, of which I am Director of Innovation, Irish Green Building Council have carried out a number of research projects and advising the construction industry and real estate sector on sustainability in the built environment. So some examples of our projects are Zero Carbon Roadmap, building a Circular Ireland, which we just launched last week, looking at the circular economy side of the construction sector, and National Roadmap for Upskilling in terms of how we're going to meet our targets. By way of delving deeper into the work over many years by the RIAI, as Kathryn advised, there's been a suite of sustainability advice, policy and guidance documents delivered by the RIAI, which concluded with the RIAI 2030 Climate Challenge and the accompanying suite of advice notes. All of these documents are available on the RIAI website. And this journey of addressing climate action and sustainability targets has now moved into this next stage of this Design for Performance project. So focusing on the RIAI Climate Challenge, for those of you not familiar with this, essentially the project has taken a life cycle analysis approach to projects and focused on 4 key indicators. So as Kathryn advised earlier, focusing on embodied carbon and setting a target for reducing operational energy, water, and health and well-being, which is a combination of indoor air quality metrics, as you can see there. So the goal with the 4 targets is to look at each one individually, set a reduction target, and see how to achieve those targets. So what are the targets in the 2030 Climate Challenge? The key message here in this image is looking at the 4 indicators and the suggested targets. A key message in this slide is to indicate that these are 2030 targets. We obviously have 2050 broader targets, but this is a stepping stone towards that and looking at the metrics associated with that decarbonisation journey. And the key message, again, is to highlight that these are indicative targets. The goal here is to encourage the industry as a whole to set targets, get key metrics, and aim to continually improve and improve upon the performance of our buildings. So what is the Design for Performance framework? Essentially, the RIAI and IGBC have taken these 4 metrics and looked at them in further detail. The Design for Performance title was deliberately selected to encourage industry to move beyond designing for compliance only and essentially looking at the broader performance and the actual building performance of a property. This slide is illustrative of the reality of compliance, let's say with a Part L model, versus the performance modeling relative to the actual meter data, and just drawing your attention to the difference there between unregulated and regulated loads within a property. So essentially, we're trying to encourage everyone to really look at these overall performance metrics of a property and a project in terms of the end and full life cycle of a property and monitor and track throughout the design and delivery process. In addition to looking at the metrics that were within the climate challenge, we've also considered the EU levels framework. And for those of you not familiar with it, essentially this is a European approach to basically asking the right question from the outset, to looking at life cycle assessment, assessing the sustainability performance of a building. And in this case, we're looking at, again, the 4 metrics that were within the RIAI Climate Challenge, and looking in more detail at level 1, the early stage consideration, level 2, the more detailed design, and then level 3, essentially the as-built, and critically, the in-use performance aspect. So Sarah later will go into more detail on the EU levels framework. Essentially, we're trying to bring a broader awareness to this overarching European framework in which we all will be operating further detail. So what is the Design for Performance framework? Essentially, it is 3 documents. We have done extensive research to try and see what is the most applicable way of conveying all this information and assisting industry in a project-specific approach. So it's getting that balance between having advice on a broader level and yet the accepting that every project needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So the first document is a work stages overlay. So we have started with a typical construction project and looked at the detailed stages and what to do when, and critically who does it when. We have a guidance document, which is essentially a Word document to delve deeper into the specifics of 4 indicators on each stage of a project. And then we have a dynamic tracker. Essentially, this is an Excel. It is a suggested document for industry to use to tailor according to their own, maybe operations within their own business, or how they may tag into other documents and processes that they have internally. So again, that is a movable item. So I'll just talk you through briefly those 3 documents. The work stage overlay. So we've taken our lead from the example of a document, which again, I would urge you to look at, which is the RIAI Design for Manufacture and Assembly document, the DFMA report, which looks at the work stages, currently the 8 stages in an RIAI contract, and looking at various metrics within each of those stages. And obviously, we acknowledge the differential between public and private contracts, design build versus traditional, large projects versus small, residential, commercial, new build renovation. Essentially, this work stage overlay is an indicative approach for you to take and adapt on a project by project basis for the 4 key indicators that we keep referring back to, and the metrics and the targets associated with each of those metrics. Sorry, with each of those indicators. The framework is a guidance document, which essentially is a word-by-word version to assist you in pulling together all of this information and understanding what is specific to your project and how to improve upon same. And then finally, the dynamic tracker. Essentially, as I said, this is an Excel on an indicator by indicator basis for you to look at the key action at each stage and assigning responsibility in terms of having lead and support. And again, as Kathryn said, collaboration is key. And we're delighted that the training sessions today are open to anyone in the construction industry, because this is key. We have huge climate targets to meet, and we really need to expedite this process and improve and deliver in a faster, more efficient and more collaborative way. So we acknowledge that there are certain risks and equally opportunities through the lifetime of a project's development, and it really is a monitoring and a tracking of those metrics and processes within that overall life cycle lens, and that is key. And or just really showing you kind of a very high level overview. The actual detail within the dynamic tracker, we wish to credit the Monoro decarbonisation open source platform information, which was designed by Grimshaw Architects and their organisations, including World Green Building Council. So really, again, in the true sense of collaboration, we're not reinventing the wheel across the industry at a European level. So the detail will be apparent within the framework when we go into that. What are the benefits? I mean, the benefits are multiple on so many levels. Essentially, this is about target setting as early as possible and tracking that journey and continually improving, and seeing the benefits of a full life cycle analysis here. And it's tracking, it's monitoring, it's verification. So you really collectively, we're looking at full performance life cycle analysis of a project. Where to start? I know there's a huge amount of information, and this is a very high level overview. There's a wealth of detail in the documents to come, but essentially just start simple, start sharing, start learning, upskilling, doing courses. Even attending today is really, we're so thrilled to see the numbers attending. and tracking the metrics, looking at your existing projects, tracking the metrics, collaborating with your design team, your clients earlier in the process. So really the metrics around each of the elements are being continually on the table for continual review. And really, it's a culture of collaboration. That is what we're trying to promote here today. So I'll leave it at that, Liz, and we can delve deeper into the documents next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sinead. So we're going a little bit deeper. So I'm going to introduce Judit Kimpian. And the title of her topic is Beyond Compliance, Why Design for Performance. But before Judit starts, I'm going to give you a little introduction of who Judit is. So Judit is an architect and policy expert renowned for shaping EU sustainable building policy, with 20 plus years in architectural practice and as former Director of Sustainable Architecture at AHR. She has led pivotal research in building performance and net zero architecture. Judit chairs the Architects Council of Europe's Sustainable Architecture Group and contributes to technical guidance to the RIBA and SIPSI. A lead author of Energy, People and Buildings. She is also a lecturer on the RIAI's Environmental Induction course and editor of the Design Performance Guidance document, as Kathryn mentioned previously. So, Judit, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Wonderful to see so many of you joining the session today. It's fantastic to have so much interest in the topic. It's been a real privilege to work with this team, with the RIAI and the IGBC on this project. As Sinead showed before, Design for Performance is an initiative by the SEAI, IGBC and RIAI, and it's really to respond to this urgency to transition fast towards a circular and decarbonized economy. Ideally so that we can continue to build and not worry about impacts in the future. And accountability plays a really important role in this. And I'm going to discuss now how Design for Performance can bring us a bit closer to this carbon neutral and circular future, and then talk about the change in the mindset that takes place when we aim to consider a building over its whole lifespan, as opposed to just targeting completion. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the performance gap, what it is, why it's such an issue, and how we can address it through verification. So what do we mean by performance? Basically, the performative aspects of buildings that have the greatest environmental and human health impacts relating to the resources consumed, i.e. the greenhouse gas emissions related to operational energy use, water consumption, and materials and construction impacts. And then what we want to see really is the quality of the built environment and value that we create with these resources and at what cost. And we want to be able to communicate all of these over a building's lifespan, effectively tracking from product stage to construction stage to use stage, end of life, and beyond in terms of recycling and reusing. There's a less visual presentation of this approach translated in the macro objectives of and indicators of the levels framework. Over the past decade, a lot of effort has gone into capturing these indicators. So we really try to select the ones that have the greatest leverage, that by recording and monitoring and targeting specific indicators around these, we really incentivize sustainable design practices. So these were drawn from different sustainable design certifications and standards, but today Levels is really recognized for providing a common language for assessing and reporting on the sustainability performance of buildings. And Levels also underpins many EU policies and directives, including the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the CPR, the taxonomy. And Design for Performance is very much based on this Levels approach to reporting environmental impacts. And Sarah and Gary will both speak more about this in their talk. So that's the resources that we're tracking against the indoor environmental quality, the climate change resilience, and the life cycle cost and value creation. So this is a diagram that you'll see over and over when we talk about life cycle consideration. This is really at the heart of all related evaluations. It shows the key life cycle stages as defined by the standard EN 15978. And the product stage, the construction, so A1 to A3 is the product stage. Then the construction stage, these two we call the upfront carbon, and then the use phase and the end of life phase. So these all relate to the material and the construction impacts, whereas the bit in the B6 and B7 is the operational energy use and operational water use, which relate to the actual operation of the building. And again, Sarah is going to speak a lot more about this, but it's really important to have this in the back of your mind when we're talking about whole life or impacts. So we are, in terms of the breakdown of embodied carbon, it's really good to understand where these big impacts are. So usually we say that A1 and A in the production phase, so the upfront carbon tends to account for more than 50% of whole life carbon. And so we are, all of these figures are based on collected data, and we really, really emphasize over and over why collecting data and tracking these is so important, not just for the sector, but for individual projects. B2 and B3, again, so the impacts in the production carbon is basically the highest impact material is concrete and steel. And again, what was surprising, that paint and glue in the replacement stage is actually really high, and then insulation in other metals in production and refurbishment stages have the highest whole life carbon impact. And then, unsurprisingly, plastics are similarly impactful across pretty much all the stages, including the insulation products. And also, please note that building services are not included in this chart, but because of their frequent replacement and maintenance cycles, they can account for quite a high impact. And there's more data emerging about that actually now. And so what we would like to see really is an increase of retrofits, which then save at least on the substructure and superstructure carbon, and some of the envelope carbon, which currently accounts for, as I said, for more than 50% of whole life carbon. And then what we'd like to see again is lower the maintenance carbon of buildings, minimize carbon for cleaning, repair, and maintenance. The more robust the construction, the longer the lifespan and the less maintenance is required, which in turn extends the replacement cycles. Lowering carbon again. And then when it comes to refurbishment, we'd like to see as much of the building retained as possible. And at the end of life stage, we would like to see as much as possible waste directed from landfill to be reused and recycled. Even if carbon-wise, it accounts for a very small proportion of the whole life carbon. But without this, where would all the recycled materials come from for the upfront carbon reductions? Again, it's worth just reinforcing the terminology briefly. Whole life cycle usually considers the environmental impact of a material or product over its lifetime from cradle to grave. And module D, as I stated before, includes reporting on impacts relating to the reuse and recycling of the materials and products. And that's often referred to as cradle to cradle. And when it comes to carbon, neither embodied carbon nor the whole life carbon includes module D. So that's really worth noting in mind. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive does require reporting this, but there are no limits associated with this. And again, so the aim of the circular approach is to achieve zero waste over the life cycle of a building, reusing and recycling all the waste. And ideally with sufficient design input, once project waste can become another's virtue, ideally eliminating the need for costly production of new materials as well as waste. And I just wanted to flag this graph because what you might see from these figures is that lifespan is absolutely crucial in this new way of thinking about buildings. Service life is really the underlying multiplier underpinning all life cycle assessment calculations, and the standard is 50 years in continental Europe, it's 60 in Britain. However, many buildings end up with a very different lifespan than planned. So let's look at why this matters. So take a period of 100 years, a building that has an actual lifespan of about 15 years, like many of the office buildings in the City of London, will be rebuilt more than 6 times in that time, while a building lasting for 60 years only 1.6 times. While the operational carbon may be similar, the resulting embodied carbon for the longer lifespan building, a longer lifespan building is much lower. And then the shorter lifespan building must re-emit carbon to be rebuilt, maintained, while a longer lasting building will have a fraction of its carbon footprint. So the notion of designing for lifespan means that we're designing for the long-term needs of occupants, we are designing more resilient buildings, and we are also designing by the lifespan of individual components, so we don't have to take a whole building apart just to service one aspect of it or one layer of it. I wanted to show this project because the recycling house is such an interesting project. It's an award-winning scheme from Hanover, Germany. It embodies this vision where all the elements of the buildings are reused or upcycled, and these recyclable building products include glue-fed solid wood elements for the structure. The recycled materials include the foundation made of recycled concrete and wall insulations made from jute bags. And yeah, so it won the state prize for architecture. And I think the idea is that with the right infrastructure, we can create compelling designs with barely emitting any carbon. Now, these diagrams are quite important. So for every project that we work on, we really try and establish where the impact hotspots are. And the method for establishing the whole life carbon impact of a building involves breaking it down into components and materials and linking these to quantities to the respective embodied carbon data. And calculating embodied carbon can really tell us where most of the impact is in the building and then allow us to find lower impact alternatives. And these graphs that Letty created, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, some of you may be familiar with it, is a ground-up movement of young built environment professionals, much like yourselves, working together pro bono to create up-to-date industry guidance and peer support. And what the graphs then show is that the substructure and superstructure form between half or 2/3 of a typical building's cradle to gate impact. So that's the upfront carbon. And this means that retaining an existing substructure and superstructure present effectively an instant 50 to 60% emissions cut compared to a new building. More than and more if you manage to retain the building envelope as well. So it means that retrofits really start off with a massive advantage in the carbon race compared to a new building, even with the most advanced construction methods and materials. Yes. I just wanted to make a quick point that, in today's world, carbon is linked to energy, and we know that energy equals effort. And until we decarbonize the production of materials and construction, embodied carbon really relates to the amount of effort that goes into constructing, maintaining, and decommissioning a building. And then carbon savings often imply that we are expending less effort in the construction and maintenance of a building. And also less effort means less waste, and that also means less cost. So we often found that on the projects where we audited embodied carbon or targeted lower embodied carbon, we ended up saving on material quantities too, and saving significant costs in the process. So there is a business case for all of this too. My colleagues will be talking about this project in another module, but it's great to see built examples in Ireland showcasing the principles of design for performance, a fantastic project in Cork. And another great example is a building you're probably all familiar with, the deep retrofit of Tom Johnson House, the new headquarters of the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications, undertaken by OPW Architectural Services. And again, the achievements will be discussed by Edel Collins of the OPW on day 3. Now I'm going to talk a bit more about the operational energy use and related carbon emissions. This is the B6 emission stage that has sparked the most controversy and which has led to the development of another key aspect of design for performance, which is a move away from estimating energy efficiency potential of buildings towards targeting achieved performance in use. So what you see on these two pictures is an energy performance certificate versus a display energy certificate that's reporting the operational rating. And we found in the 2010s that there is a large discrepancy, and we started looking at the causes of this. And so what we realized that in order for us to be able to create these certificates, the industry didn't really want to be responsible for what we call user behavior. So what equipment people put in buildings, the as-built factors, the operating conditions, so occupancy patterns, hours of use, etc. So a kind of notional building was created for legislative compliance, and that's a building under standardized conditions. But what we found in the UK, and also what you found in Ireland, that these methodologies defining this energy performance certificate and the calculations, the DIAP and NIAP calculations behind them actually don't relate to outcomes. And that's a really big issue. And I think what's fantastic is that the emergence of the Internet of Things has allowed low-cost wireless sensors to begin to monitor buildings in a bit more detail, and that doing this verification loop has become really financially feasible, and more data is coming out about not just about the performance gap, but ways of closing this. And in this case, the data showed in the AMBER study that the schools analyzed were around, the performance gap was around 20%. And yes, worth analyzing the causes of that. I'm going to show a few more slides after. I just wanted to show you this other Irish study, Mind the Energy Performance Gap, which was testing the accuracy of building energy performance certificates in Ireland, showing a similar gap between the or the lack of a relationship really between the calculations and actual and performance that was modeled to represent actual building conditions. So, and that's kind of unsurprising, but it just shows why it's so important to get a better handle on what actually happens of buildings. And one way of doing that is operational stage evaluations. So you do occupier surveys, building visits and interviews. You read the meters and sub-meters, ideally try and reconcile them, especially if they work well. Not a common occurrence in my experience. And then you can also log quite easily indoor environmental quality meters. And what I do on every single project is the thermal imaging, and obviously blow door tests are mandatory. But there are other instruments for building fabric checks too, so you can demonstrate whether the U values you designed and intended were actually implemented in the project. And there were a number of research projects across the EU and the UK, and now best practice is considered to involve an as-built as well as an in-use check to effectively close this feedback loop. So this is a quick snapshot of the RIAI's guidance, which shows that carrying out an as-built, as Sinéad said before, carrying out an as-built validation of how your employer's requirements translated into the build project. And this is also a really good way to address any performance liability issues. And so these as-built checks, they don't only help with the quality control at handover, but they also ensure that the performance measurements that you then do in operation relate to the actual building as constructed and not the design. Again, helping with any liability issues, which are actually quite rare. So crucially, because the commissioning is late on most buildings, the first year becomes the year of seasonal commissioning and adjustments. This is very common, and especially for larger buildings, but not uncommon for homes either. And this is when the meters get reconciled, where all the set points and profiles are checked and adjusted, the openings are serviced, the manuals are finalized, and all the as-built information gets kind of consolidated. And in the standard DMB contract, this period is usually extremely chaotic. I'm sure you'll testify to that. And things often get missed, and that often results in building underperformance. And if outcomes form part of a contract, then most of the issues are more likely to be rectified and without adversity. And this has been our experience very much on projects that have adopted this approach. This as-built check time is also a point to take stock of the as-built upfront carbon figures. So auditing the as-built building for updating its carbon footprint provides an extra layer of accountability. Effectively, if the whole design team knows that most of the materials will be verified upon completion, they're more likely to ring-fence critical items, for example, types of insulation from value engineering. And then going into the post-occupancy, so the post-completion checks. So just again, flagging terminology, the term building performance evaluations these days is often used interchangeably with POEs. And traditionally, a POE looks at a wider range of performance metrics, including energy consumption, indoor air quality, and building systems. And it was really developed to evaluate, there's a standard, a BS standard, developed to evaluate how well a building performs against design expectations. And the RIAI's approach really takes a sensible mix of approaches, and crucially, it recommends planning for measured outcomes from the very start of the project. And I think I'm going to use POE and BP interchangeably in the presentation as not disciplined enough. So just to go have a look at what these metrics mean in practice and who is going to, we might ask, pay for all of this. And so whenever I talk about this topic, I always emphasize that actually the question should be, why would anyone not pay for this evaluation, especially when they are planned in from the start of a project, so you don't spend a lot of time having to collect material data and information that's difficult to access because you've prepared it up front. Yeah, so we know that without verification of the as-built and the in-use energy and carbon metrics, buildings really routinely underperform, and clients ultimately have to meet the extra cost of the unused and underutilized equipment. This could be metering, building management systems, sensors, controls, sometimes they can amount to between 2 to 5% of capital cost. It's a lot of things not to pay for, but not see the benefit of. And there's also the misplaced value engineering, so fabric performance, air tightness, all the openings, floor to floor heights, thermal mass, entrance lobbies, all of these things, if they make a crucial contribution to the final building, if they are value engineered ad hoc, that will compromise performance. And there are always increased management and maintenance and energy costs. So what we found was between 50 to 44% of total annual energy costs could be saved in the buildings that we studied, and that can amount to tens of thousands of pounds per year for a larger building. And then there is the mitigation costs, which can be up to 50% of annual energy costs, and the profit loss of consultants and contractors having to do things over and over again, engaging in value engineering, trying to stop needless value engineering or harmful value engineering, and the productivity loss for occupiers and FM. So away from the polemic. Yeah, so all of this data comes from the UK building performance evaluations that have been carried out on larger cohorts of buildings between 2012 and 2016. And I was really lucky to be able to work on many of these projects and also on the data collection, and a lot of CIBSE and RIBA guidance, as well as the RIBA's climate challenge, was based on the outcomes from all of these research projects. And I think you see 9, 10 of them here. What's interesting is that we were able to develop what we call these energy bars, the energy representation of the project, and not just the scale of it, but also where the energy is used in a building, what we call energy and uses. And the bar chart shows these estimated and achieved consumption of 7 of these buildings, and the bottom bar shows describes the calculated energy use adjusted for as-built conditions, and the actual equipment and operating conditions. And the top bar shows the measured performance profile. I think what this offers is that you can have really quick and important insights. For example, the building highlighted there had really significant issues with heating, ventilation, and so we can then start drilling down into what didn't work on those projects, on that particular project, in that particular energy use, energy end use. And so learning from the projects that didn't work, for our next project, we worked really closely with UCL, IED, Institute of American Design and Engineering. You might find as well that teaming up with academic partners at the start of this journey is really helpful. Taking kind of projects and building sometimes aspects of them offline. But what we just did a live project because we so wanted to see this work. We embedded performance basically from the start of the project all the way to completion, and well into, so the reporting went into the defects liability period. We basically set up a kind of golden thread of information. We called it the building performance register, where we don't just track the metrics, but also what kind of aspects of the design allowed the project to meet those metrics and limits from design all the way to, we ring fence, we put it in the building contract, the contractor's prelims. It informed the FM scope, and then when you're in the use phase, you use it to verify that your targets have been achieved. And it's very helpful when you want to do reports about what worked really well. You can go back to that same structure. So it creates a kind of golden thread of continuity through the project, whereas normally in a more adversarial project setup, a lot of that information gets lost in the fray. So we effectively follow this design for performance approach on the Civic Centre in the UK, working closely with the client to target an operational rating of A, which means measuring energy use, and we aim for less than 70 kilowatt hours per meter square per year for annual consumption, with about half of that offset by renewable electricity. And what we found was that even with this approach, the building ended up consuming more than a third of what we estimated in the first year, which is actually a really common occurrence. So you might find that 130% more of a low is still relatively low, but the discrepancy was high enough for the design to take steps to address this performance gap during this defects liability period. The advantage was that all the key protagonists were still engaged and involved in the project. So just very quickly, we started with a simple review, just collecting bills and certificates and interviews, visiting the building, reviewing its use and operation, discussing with occupants to gather feedback on what has and has not worked well. So occupants may also share their energy bills for review by the design team. Issues to review can range from systems to materials to occupancy patterns. I think the themes and issues to review should be really set at the start of the design process. And then if you find any major discrepancies, which we did here, then you look at the performance figures more closely, and you might want to engage an independent consultant to do this as per the RIAI's guidance. But we didn't go down that route because we had UCL's researchers working with us, which was super helpful. But what we did do is go after the submetering data, so this energy end use data really early, and combined with the feedback received from the occupants, we could start the diagnostics very early on. And we could almost immediately see from the comments and from the energy results that basically the automated windows for night purge needed adjusting. they were opening too much in the winter, not enough in the summer. And the lighting controls need adjusting. You can see here from the energy figures, the heating and the lighting were way out. And then we also found through thermal imaging that there was quite a lot of thermal bridgings through the acoustic louvers. We could check the operation of openings and profiling of controls, and the occupant satisfaction survey also supported our findings. But basically, there was some thermal bridging relating to the ventilation openings. And very common that night purge wasn't enabled in the naturally ventilated building, which is a problem for overheating in the summer. But once we addressed these controls issues, or the contractor did, thankfully, for heating and lighting, we could see that in year 2, the consumption was much lower. Albeit the heat pump recommissioning was still planned when this data was captured. I think what we found was that this way of contracting for performance really helped align project team incentives. So we effectively ended up inadvertently setting up a less adversarial and more collaborative project. And ultimately, this delivered an award-winning headquarters for the client on time and on budget, and at a cool 96% saving on energy bills compared to their previous sites. I think what Liz kindly mentioned my book on this topic. What we find is that it's extremely difficult to find projects that have both the data and are inspiring in terms of design. What we think of as climate-ready architecture is being able to show fantastic architecture together with achieved performance figures, both embodied and operational, in case energy consumption, but ultimately more broadly, including indoor environmental quality and water consumption, as well as design performance prescribes. And ideally, we'll get to a point where this is done really effortlessly, mostly through automation. So just to reiterate the benefits of verification, for the client, there's the accountability for quality. And that's quite a big challenge in some cases, and the big bonus. There is a layer of cost control that helps, that stops undermining or compromising quality, and achieving expected performance outcomes. That can't be a bad thing for any client. And lowering maintenance costs, better user experience, and long-term building resilience are all really big bonuses. And for the design team, obviously the improved productivity and the faster innovation cycles. We also found that it's such an inspiring way to do CPDs. So there's nothing like being able to go back and revisit all the things that you designed in the building and seeing it in practice, noticing the things that don't quite work as you expected. Big learning experiences. And and in terms of business development, so being able to evidence your value creation. There's a fantastic Danish publications about this architect document your value creation, but it isn't just for architects, it's for the whole construction sector. We're traditionally, we could be better at doing that in the future. So just key takeaways, whole life carbon limits and verification. So design for performance supports a transition to a true circularity. So just to reiterate, we're trying to get to a point where we really don't have to worry about the impacts of construction, and construction begins to, we can kind of relax a bit more about the efficiency and just focus on creating environments that are healthy and regenerative. Then design for whole life versus practical completion, which offers direct and long-term business benefits, which I showed before, and also some practical challenges in the short term, because it's quite a lot to absorb, as Sinéad was saying. And and as Sinéad says, start where you can. You can unlock opportunities for your business through learning and innovation. But start slow if you can. Partner with academics or researchers or even students. It's a really great way to come up with new solutions that we so desperately need to progress the sector. Data is power. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
That's wonderful, Judith. Thank you so much. So our next speaker is Sarah O'Dwyer. She'll be talking about legislative context binding and non-binding. So just give a quick little bio. Sarah is an architect and academic specializing in climate responsive design and architectural education. She leads the Masters of Science in Environmental Design of Buildings at Cardiff University and lectures in the Climate Action at TU Dublin. Her PhD explores whole life carbon in architectural pedagogy. I can never say that word. A member of the RIAI Education Task Force and RIAI Sustainability Task Force, she was a former chair. And Sarah contributed to both the new Standard of Competency Architecture and the RIAI 2030 Climate Challenge documents. She's also a lecturer on the RIAI's Environmental Induction course, a very busy lady. So,
yes. I hate actually those things being read out.
So Sarah, I'm going to let you take the floor.
Great. I have been given the unenviable task of taking you through legislation, which I know is not the most riveting topic, but we'll hopefully get through it together. I'm going to go through essentially it's going to be a whistle-stop tour, 30 minutes of kind of international, national guidance and legislation that kind of impacts the design for performance issues. Before I do that, I suppose, and we've touched on it already this morning, about sometimes acknowledging why we're trying to do this. And that's why I was very interested actually in the response to the poll. The majority of people appear to be here just to kind of do better in their designs, which is fantastic, really amazing to see. And it's also, I suppose, important maybe to look back about how far we've come, and even the way that we're talking now in terms of like holistic issues and design for performance. So trying to do like the best thing we can and make achieve the best quality we can, rather than necessarily just ticking the compliance box, which we have seen hasn't really served us in the long run or in the bigger picture, bigger scale. And also to kind of plot where like there's so many different this is a piece of work I did in relation to my own research, which is trying to plot like all the different terms and all the different initiatives and things that have kind of contributed to where we've come and where we're going. You know, in the middle there, going from environmental design, talking about sustainable design, talking about green buildings, and in the 90s very much talking about the greenhouse gas and the ozone layer and that kind of thing, going into talking about carbon neutral design and net zero design and holistic design and all of these terms that essentially mean the same thing. And initiatives like all the different COPs that have taken place, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, they're like the big headline ones of those. This is the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, the International Panel on Climate Change down in the bottom, and their kind of annual reports about all of industry, about where we are and where we're going. I suppose almost kind of running into the pandemic, the climate emergency and all of the kind of rhetoric from different organizations and different governments. Greta Thunberg's school strikes were around that time as well. So I suppose that was, a tipping point in terms of this kind of really just being bumped up onto the radar in terms of climate. It's guess the first time we really started talking about climate emergencies, climate change design. As particularly as well with one of the pieces of legislation I'll be talking about, the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, bill in 2021. And now I suppose there's a lot of dots at the end, because we're still, I think, grappling. No one wants to use the word sustainability anymore. it's got a lot of, I suppose, greenwash maybe entitled to associated with it now, and we're still not quite sure what term we're landing on. But here are some of the ones that are around and that you might hear of. So resilient design, restorative, regenerative design, climate resilient design, and even this concept of design for performance is a step away, as I said, from just meeting regulation. So although I'm going to spend 30 minutes talking about legislation and regulation, I think a really important thing to realize is that if we only design to be compliant and to meet minimum requirements, then it actually won't be enough. Where that usually gets us is and I really love this diagram on the left, it's idea of sustainability, I suppose, is a thing as being kind of neutralizing, or, not making things any worse, but certainly not necessarily making them better or contributing to that more good end of the scale. And legislation tends to put us somewhere between that green, somewhere here between the green and the sustainable node on that line, and actually what we're really striving for. And I'd say design for compliance probably sits somewhere in there, and design for performance is aiming to get us up onto the right-hand side of this diagram. And I think that's something to take away. You need to know what the legislation is and what the minimum requirements currently are and what they will be coming down the track, and how your work contributes to meeting kind of national and global initiatives. But it's also good to have in the back of your mind that if that's all that you do, then it actually won't be enough to get us where we need to get to, in a nutshell. So first I'm going to, I'll also preface this by saying the next 30 minutes are going to be a ton of legislative information. It is not intended that you're going to be able to take all this in 30 minutes. You'll have these recordings and you'll have the slides as reference. So it's more just to kind of point you to what is there. For some of you, this will be stuff you already know and are aware of. For others, it will be new. Even if you're aware of it, I even find it's always good to look at it again and remember, because it is quite complicated and quite complex, and there's so much of it. So you're either in for a refresher, or this is going to be new information. So the first thing, I suppose, at an international level, and I've mentioned some of them, this is, again, quite convoluted, and there's many of them. So I'll just pull out the two that you probably would have heard of, even if you've never looked at this before. And that was the Kyoto Protocol, which was kind of the first legally binding, well, we can put binding in inverted commas, but the first kind of agreed global initiative where we came together and said, okay, this is the target. We're going to try and reduce greenhouse gases to 5% below the 1911 levels. And that was aimed to be achieved between 2008 and 2012. And then the second one was the Paris Agreement. And this is where we begin to talk about temperatures. So we're trying to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5. In subsequent COPs, that has been fixed at, yes, we should be targeting 1.5. And there's several other treaties and agreements that Ireland has signed that has come out of these kind of UN conventions and the COP annual meetings. It's worth noting they're binding, as said, but it's left to each country to kind of set their own contribution towards them. And there's no penalty or for not necessarily meeting them. And that is different, I guess, to the EU targets. So they're more aspirational. They do kind of trickle down into our national legislation, and, our national legislation will refer to these things, and they do kind of drive it in a very kind of abstracted way, I would say. But they're not enforceable, I guess. They're just kind of notional and aspirational, but they do set the tone, I guess, for what happens below that at both an EU and a national level. Where there has been the most work, the most kind of new things coming out of is at EU level. And sorry, it's worth saying this again, this is not like this is the only thing that's happening at this level. I'm just kind of pulling out the most pertinent things of the context. So we've kind of 5 main things, and many of these actually have happened just in the last kind of 3-4 years. They're very new. One is the European Green Deal, which the Fit for 55 package comes from that. There are the upcoming EPBD recast, the reforms. There's the EU taxonomy and there's EU levels. The EU, many of these, I suppose there's one of these that you're going to find probably mentioned across nearly every presentation, and that's EU levels. I know Gary will pick up on the EPBD reforms, a recast after me, and I know Eoin after that will be talking about the kind of financial end and the role of the taxonomy. So again, it's no harm to kind of hear about this now a little bit, and then your knowledge of these will be reinforced and built up throughout the different presentations. So taking these in turn, the EU Green Deal was a really integral part of that current in the EU Commission strategy. Basically, there's a UN 2030 agenda, which is also linked back to those Sustainable Development Goals. So all of these things kind of build on each other and tweak on each other. The EU is a bureaucratic agency, so there is a plethora of different commissions and committees and policies and documents. So you're trying to get your head around what they all are and how they're connected. And how they build on each other, essentially. The EU Green Deal is essentially a roadmap. It sets out the target. It says the EU is to become the first climate neutral continent, and the goal to do that is by 2050. It also, I suppose, going back to this holistic thing, talks about more than just numbers and energy. It's about protecting human life. It's about protecting animals and plants. It's got that kind of biodiversity or landscaping kind of aspect to it, non-human species aspect to it. It's also about helping economies and companies to be world leaders in things like clean products and technologies, and also this idea that, the kind of societal end, it's about making sure that these improvements are available to everyone. So you might have heard of a just transition or an inclusive transition. So as we transition from one business as usual kind of fossil fuel dependent approach to this green approach, that everybody is involved in that, and that's open to everybody. It covers like pretty much the whole, every kind of business, every type of economy that you can think of, and many of those overlap. And I suppose the big piece or the big headline, which is why I bolded it and also put it in green here because it can be confusing, is the target is to have a 55% reduction, like across all of those areas and of business, of economy, to have a 55% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So that's fast approaching. And that 5% relates back to or compares back to what those greenhouse gas emissions were in 1990. So it's a percentage improvement from 1990. And then also for EU, this idea of becoming climate neutral by 2050. A really important part then of that EU Green Deal is the Fit for 55 package. And that's a major package, I suppose, that arose out of that. Again, it covers, now we're splitting down again. So we've got the Fit for 55 under the EU Green Deal, and all of the Fit for 55 package, hence the name, is related to that idea of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by 55%. So it was adopted in 2023. So again, this is quite fresh and quite new. There's again a network of initiatives, and I'm going to just mention some of them here. The ones that kind of more directly impact on the construction industry, but they do take in transport, and they take in land use and forestry, energy, fuels, aviation, again, a whole plethora of industries. There's also, in this idea for it to be a just transition, there's a social climate fund. So that's for the more vulnerable member states who may not have the capital to kind of do these initiatives. So there's a fund provided for it to help with that. As I said, it talks about the fuels used in aviation and fuels in private vehicles. And then there's three. Again, I'm not going to go into any more detail, just to know if you're really interested, you can follow up. Follow up more detail on these, but just to know that this is where these things come from and what they, in a nutshell, what they mean. So there's a carbon border adjustment mechanism and an emissions trading system. And this, I suppose, is to do with the idea of things moving within the EU and not penalizing, let's say not penalizing manufacturers who might be taking a cost hit for improving the carbon of their products versus another competitor who may not be. So there are some mechanisms to try and help balance that kind of thing out. We also have under this package the Energy Efficiency Directive, so more acronyms, EED, and that is looking at improving the building's energy efficiency and to decrease the energy consumption. And I suppose the difference in the grey box there, the difference between the EED and the EPBD is that the ED sets upper limits for energy consumption. So think of it like an umbrella or a ceiling that you can't break, whereas the EPBD is actually trying to have initiatives or ways that you can increase energy efficiency so that you don't break that upper limit. And then the Renewable Energy Directive is a little bit more straightforward, I think, in its terminology. I mean, in terms of what it is associated to what its title says, is just essentially about trying to increase the proportion of renewables that are being used across all industries. So it's not just necessarily tied to buildings. There's a lot in that. So again, come back to this, as a reference point. You're not anticipated that you'll be able to hold on to all of that in your brain, but that just know that there is a kind of I suppose, a spectrum of things there. Then I suppose the big one in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of newness and going back to what Judit was mentioning about embodied carbon, this is the EPBD recast will be, I suppose, the next big pusher and player in this. Again, it's kind of interesting to look back at where we've come from. But majority of you are architects, majority of you are working on building projects from what I can see, so you will be very familiar with the EPBD up to this point. But I guess the idea is always that it's kind to improve things, bridge gaps, increase standards, push things further, and I suppose the recast now that was adopted, that was published last May 2024, is another step in that journey. It relates back, so it's all related. So it's relating back to the overall objective of the EU Green Deal, that 55% by 2030. So this is just one piece of that puzzle. And we have until 29th of May 2026 to put this into national law. The big takeaways, I suppose, will be this movement to here's yet another acronym. We've had nearly zero energy buildings, and now we will be moving to zero emission buildings, or ZEBs will be the new target. What that means, or what that impacts from 2028, it's going to impact on public buildings that are larger than 1,000 meters squared, and from 2030 it's for all new buildings. So it's doing the same kind of stepping stone that we've seen with other recasts of this, where they start with public and they'll move to a new, and eventually it will move to all and existing. So what this actually will mean is that there is going to be zero on-site emissions from fossil fuels permitted. There's going to be a very low amount of energy. The cost optimal level will come, provided. So it would be expected that you are balancing what your needs with your wants, I suppose, your needs with your demands on site, or through maybe a district system, and that a very low proportion of that will actually be coming from a different source. And I suppose the big one, and I've highlighted in yellow, and Gary is going to talk about this in terms of the national methodology for this in the next section, is this requirement now to declare and to calculate the global warming potential, or the embodied carbon. It'll need to be disclosed through the EPCs. Again, the same targets, 2028 and 2030. There's also some provision within this to increase use of solar, to gradually phase out fossil fuel powered boilers, and also to increase basically infrastructure for both electric vehicles and electric bikes. So just in bullet points on the right-hand side, the main things are this zero energy building, the introduction of the global warming potential calculation, the solar, boiler phase out, and EVs. So there's a lot in it. And as I said, we have until middle of 2026, so only a year to put this into law. There's and it came up in one of the, I think, questions earlier about some other aspects to it. So there's there is also a move, I suppose, a big move to, and this comes from the Fit for 55 package as well, this focus on existing buildings, which are becoming, I'm sure you're experiencing it as well, like an increasing part of the work of an architect is about the retrofit and the refurb and the existing buildings rather than new. And it ties into lots of different aspects like circular economy, etc. So there will be, again, I'm not going into the detail of these, just so flagging it, there will be this introduction of minimum energy performance standards for non-residential buildings, and it's there'll be trigger or thresholds associated with basically the lowest performers within the kind of mix of buildings of the country. There'll be a binding target to increase the average and energy performance of the national stock by 16% by 2030 in comparison to 2020, and up to 22% by 2035. So essentially what's that saying is that taking stock of the buildings in Ireland, the existing, what's the worst performing, and then how can we improve its performance by 2030. 2030 is kind of fast approaching. I suppose that's the kind of little bit daunting thing with all of this, because for it to be, you'll know, with a building project, you know, you might be well into a process now that might be delivered close to then. Although 2030 is 5 years away, it's actually quite immediate for us all in our workflows and how projects work. There's also talking about long-term renovation strategies, and yes, there will be this introduction of a building renovation passport. I suppose it's supposed to guide owners into what's being done, what could be done, and that you would kind of, the idea I understand is that you'll collect kind of the measures in one place, and that will become part, I guess, of the building handover if that building's being sold or passed on. But again, the detail of these things is not forthcoming quite yet. There's also a lot of other documentation and frameworks and things that are supposed to enable better practice. So there's going to be increased digitalization, particularly of the EPCs. There's supposed to be the continued provision of the one-stop shops and more data collection and sharing. So again, not just kind of meeting the requirements and doing what you're supposed to do, but also there should be improved sharing and networking of that data and understanding of it and transparency of the flow of that. So there's huge amount in that. So we kind of know what the targets are in terms of what as a Irish government is supposed to be doing under the EU directive. We don't have a huge amount of detail as of yet on what that looks like in practice. As I said, Gary is going to talk through the SEI's current national methodology for the global warming potential in the next session. So the fourth one of these is the EU taxonomy. So again, others will talk about this, but just to know that it is binding, but there's been a little bit of pushback. So France, for example, in January 2025 asked that they could not meet some of the requirements because they are basically, it goes into so many industries and it is so difficult to kind of translate what the requirement is into practice. I don't know if anyone has been working on projects that are trying to align with this that might have experienced that. Essentially, what it's trying to do is to categorize economic activity into assessing whether it's environmentally friendly or not, or how sustainable it is. And it has a series of objectives. It has criteria associated with those objectives. And you as a business or a practice or a project or any economic activity basically assesses your business against those objectives and reports on whether you then can say that you're aligned with the EU taxonomy or not. It also has this aspect of the CS or D. So I had to go to the next slide to remember what the acronym stood for, but the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So this is the way that essentially companies are disclosing how they meet or how they align with the EU taxonomy. It is quite and the last session we'll talk about this, but it is supposed as a driver for how, and other questions came up about cost and incentive and financial aspects. I suppose aligning with this and be able to get this as a badge is, I suppose, an incentive for maybe some clients or some developers or some owners to be able to say that they're aligned, and that could have impact on their I suppose the value of their company or the value of their practice, that they're able to say that they're aligned with these things. But it is, from anyone I've spoken to who's been trying to work with it or trying to do it, the translation of the overall aim and the criteria down into practice, and how can end up a little tick boxy, and how it actually translates into real on the ground practice, or how it translates to your just day-to-day work, is, I think, still quite abstract for a lot of people. Happy to take comments or questions on that. And then the last one, again, a big one, is this EU levels. So it's worth just stepping back and think EU levels, when it was first introduced, was essentially an environmental assessment method in its first when it first came on the scene, and a way to kind of offer the same language and a kind of unifying guidance for how to measure, how to design for a range of sustainability criteria, and how to measure them, and how to do that then consistently. So the levels of the name refers a little bit to kind of the leveling of the playing field as such, or the leveling of the criteria. It also refers to the different levels at which a practitioner can engage with it, because you can do it just as qualitatively, so just look at the guidance and kind of try and look at it as best practice. You can engage with it quantitatively, so you can follow its suggested metrics and methods, and then you can also take it the next step and do monitoring. So it is designed, I suppose, a little bit different to maybe other environmental assessment methods. And by that, I mean, if I haven't said it, to things like Brien and LEED and the HPI, it is designed to be a design tool, a design aid, not just something that you use to check if your building reaches a certain badge at the end. So they include core sustainability indicators. They actually have really comprehensive manuals, which are free to download and free to access. It's very strong on circularity. So it's definitely worth checking out. As I said, you will come across it in lots of the different sessions, if not all of them, and they do give key indicators, key metrics, ways to kind of look at it. It's also a way to show, going back to the EU taxonomy, they use green levels. So if you're kind of doing stuff in line with EU green levels, then you're thought to be meeting or aligning with aspects of the EU taxonomy. So it's all bundled in together.
Just to say, you've got 5 minutes left, Sarah.
That's fine. That should be okay. Just the national level then, the Climate Action Bill, it originally passed in 2015, and then there were significant amendments to it in 2021. And this is another slightly different target to the EU target, because now the EU target EU Green Deal is talking about 51% by 2030 relative to 2018 levels. Relative to 1990 levels. This is talking about 51% by 2030, but relative to 2018 levels. So as part of the Climate Action Bill, the government is charged with producing climate action plans each year. They're released annually, usually in January. And these kind of set different plans and targets for the coming year in order to meet that overall goal of the 51% over by 2030. So each year kind of ratchets up and does take a stock of what has happened in the previous years. A big part of this, at least in legislative terms, is the kind of associated budgets with each of the kind of 6 vital sectors that have been identified. We're actually just heading into in the middle there, the second tranche of budget. So that's actually under review and consultation at the minute. What the budgets were set out initially, but they're kind of under review now, because we're heading into that second period, the 2026 to 2030. And the idea is that you will essentially have, each sector will have a budget associated with it. Those sectors are electricity, transport, commercial buildings and public, residential, industry, agriculture, and then there's an other. If you look at kind of what the 2018 emissions are and the reduction over here, the corresponding reductions anticipated, they don't always align. So there is a bit of politics at play here. Agriculture is the biggest emitter but has the lowest reduction to meet, for example. And this is no shade on farmers or agriculture, but just to know that it's not just about the pure numbers. There's politics behind these, and forestry and land use, for example, still has no associated reduction number associated with, because we're still discussing and liaising what that should be. So there's lots of these that will have an impact on your work. I suppose, again, it's a little abstract, but just to know that all of the things that we're doing as an industry are contributing to or not adding to whether or not we meet these targets, these kind of buildings, the transport and the residential buildings targets. And then just a little bit on the climate challenge, because I know we've discussed it. It's just two things I want to point out. One is, suppose, just the scale of the reductions in comparison to our current Part L that the climate challenge sets are quite significant. So they look at like between 40 and 60% reductions. And the other thing, and it came up in the questions, is that it includes both regulated and unregulated loads, or what's called plug loads. So all of our legislation to date has not dealt with the unregulated or the plug roads. The climate challenge includes those. So the challenge is even more. So just to note that there are targets given for domestic, for non-domestic, and that I also want to emphasize, and I think I'd be curious to know kind of what kind of puts people off maybe from engaging with this, is that the idea is that it is a challenge, so that it's not intended necessarily that you're going to be able to meet these, but that you're going to challenge yourself to try to. So just to note that I think there's a fear that if you sign up to it, you're going to be somehow liable for not meeting it. But it's just something to think about and to maybe discuss a little bit further in the Q&A. The key takeaway then would just be, say, if you only do what you're currently legally required to do, it's not going to be enough, and we really have to majorly move away from a kind of business as usual approach. All of this is overwhelming, and I'm very aware of that, but every small action really is worth doing. It might be, in terms of legislation, look at your preparedness for that legislative or policy change. Are there areas that are going to be of your own business that are going to be impacted, and what can you do now to prepare for that? All of those binding international agreements, they progress really slowly, but they do build on each other. And although it might feel abstracted or unconnected at that kind of high level, all of our daily working lives contributes towards achieving those. And I think there is I always prefer to talk about opportunities and empowerment than the shame and the blame when it comes to climate issues. So even looking at how they work is a process that maybe you could adapt. You could set a target, evaluate how you work, diagnose what's happening, try and take action, and try and reduce, and keep repeating that cycle in every way that you operate. The EU policy is developing really fast. It's coming thick, it's coming fast. So try and change as much, or prepare yourself now for those changes that are coming quite soon. And you need to find something that works for you. It's been said, but I'm going to reiterate it. Just start with even your usual approach, see what chunks of it you can take off and take it from there. We're in a kind of a lucky position now, particularly with global warming potential. We've got time to kind of work towards what we're going to be asked to do now, in a year's time, or it'll be enacted in a year. And I'm going to leave it, I suppose, just for Gary to pick up there in terms of what the national methodology for how we're going to deal with that GWP aspect will be. Thank you.
That's lovely. That's great, Sarah. My next stage, I'm going to introduce Gary O'Sullivan from SEAI, implementing policy life cycle global warming potential calculation methodology for buildings. But before I do, I'm going to introduce Gary. So Gary is the Programme Manager for Embodied Carbon with the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. He is responsible for the development of life cycle global warming potential calculation methodology to meet the requirements of Article 7, Annex 2 of the recast EPBD, Energy Performance of Building Directive. He has extensive experience in certification of construction products against CPR, along with agreement certification of innovative construction products. So Gary, I'm going to let you take over if that's okay.
Hey, thanks, Liz, and
Lovely.
Thanks for the opportunity to present today. My presentation is going to be on the life cycle global warming potential calculation methodology, which is a new requirement under the recast EPBD. So over the last year or so, RIAI have gone out with an RFQ to engage consultants to assist with the development of life cycle global warming potential calculation methodology and the necessary inputs, the data that will be fed into those that calculation engine. So we engaged Ramble to assist with taking a review, I suppose, of the inputs and the various databases that are available there in terms of environmental product declarations to be fed into the calculation method. And RPS, RKD were engaged to assist with the development of a calculation methodology. And I suppose we concluded that work back in December, and subsequent to that, then there has been work done across Europe on a guidance document, which I'll go into in a later slide, called the Delegated Act. And we've used the best from Ramble's report, RKD's report, and the trajectory of the Delegated Act to develop our own manual, which is the Life Cycle Global Warming Calculation Methodology. And all three of these documents are currently available on our website, and we're engaged in a public consultation looking for feedback on those documents. So first of all, it's to raise the awareness of this new requirement. So for life cycle global warming potential, also referred to as whole life carbon. It's an assessment of carbon emissions along the full life cycle of a building. It includes both the operational and the embodied carbon emissions. And it is now going to be a mandatory requirement that this figure is disclosed on the EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate for buildings. So just to set a bit of background on where this has been driven from. So across Europe, construction industry is responsible for approximately 36% of greenhouse gas emissions. This stems from construction, usage, renovation, demolition. In Ireland, that figure is 37% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. And under the European Green Deal, which was published back in December of 2019, it established an action plan to move forward to a clean, circular economy, whilst restoring biodiversity, cutting pollutants, and reaching climate neutrality by 2050. Under the EU Green Deal policy, the Fit for 55 package and the Circular Economy Action Plan were two initiatives that were particularly relevant to the construction sector. Under the Fit for 55 package of legislation, there's a requirement for the union's carbon emissions to be cut by 55% by 2030. And that compelled a revision to the EPBD, which was processed and adopted in April of 2024. So Article 7.2 requires the life cycle global warming potential calculation, and as I said previously, a requirement to appear on the EPC. So stemming down from the EPBD and the levels framework that Sarah spoke about, and specifically indicator 1.2, which deals with life cycle global warming potentials, we have at a product level, we have a EN standard 15804, and it gives guidance on how we establish the environmental indicators for specific product and construction materials. And then at a building level, we've EN 15978, which gives guidance on how we combine those indicators to do a full assessment of the life cycle analysis. And just to say that currently, Article 32 of the recast EPBD empowers the Commission to adopt a delegated act. That delegated act will replace Annex 3 of the recast EPBD and is currently being worked upon by the European Commission. It's not due for publication until the end of this year. So we're operating in a sort of a little bit of a blind spot at the moment. We're trying to preempt the trajectory of the delegated act, give guidance to the public sector on how to approach the calculation methodology, but at the same time, we haven't seen sight of the completed delegated act relating to this particular calculation methodology. So just to give a little context in terms of timelines, so we are, as we said, out for public consultation currently on our best estimate of a global warming potential calculation methodology. The delegated act, as I said, comes by the end of this year. It's actually December 2025. In January of 2027, we must, as a nation, notify the European Commission of a roadmap to introduce global warming potential calculations. We also need to notify them of how it is we're going to collect information to inform that roadmap with a view to setting limit values by 2030. So under the recast EPBD, there's a requirement to produce life cycle global warming calcs for buildings in excess of 1,000 square meters by the 1st of January 2028, and for all new buildings as of the 1st of January 2030. So we have in one band of European directives, we have the recast EPBD, but we also have the CPR acquis process, which is happening in parallel. And the CPR acquis is the construction product regulation. And heretofore, the construction product regulation mandated for 7 essential characteristics of building materials. And it looked at various different performance indicators such as strength, fire, robustness. Under the CPR acquis, there is now an 8th essential characteristic or indicator being brought in, which is the environmental indicator, which will effectively mean that, so we have circa 400 HENS, harmonized European standards across Europe, to which manufacturers manufacture their building products to, and they can CE mark their product in accordance with the Annex Zs of those harmonized standards. And those standards are, the harmonized standards, or annexes rather, are being revised to give guidance on environmental declarations that will now appear on the DOPC. But that is a lengthy process, and their Commission have published a timeline for completion of that process, and that extends out to 2023. So eventually, DOPCs will be the new currency, and we will be primarily using the environmental indicators published in the DOPCs that will take precedence over any other environmental declaration for a product. As I said, the timeline, there's quite a considerable amount of work to be done in this regard, and the Commission have prioritized the materials that will be the most impactful on the embodied carbon side of things. So steel and concrete and masonry will be brought forward in the programme, and the less impactful items will follow on in due course. So again, it's about the measure of the operational and embodied carbon, the whole life cycle emissions of the building. And EN 15978 outlines the following modules and phases and stages of the building life cycle. So the first phase is the production stage, and it looks after the embodied carbon of the manufactured materials. So it looks at extraction, it looks at transportation to manufacturing facility, it looks at the manufacturing process itself, and it quantifies the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that phase. The next phase then of the calculation is dealing with the construction stage. Again, we're looking at transportation of material to site and the embodied carbon associated with the the building, the construction phase of the building. The next phase is the use phase of the building. We're looking at maintenance, replacement and repair, and in particular, this particular module considers the operational energy use. So the BER, the Building Energy Rating, will factor into this module of the assessment. Under the EPBD, the design life of the building has been given a 50-year duration. So we will be taking the operational energy, we will be multiplying it by 50 years if it is a solid fuel or a liquid, or if it's electricity, we will be applying in line with the SEAI statistics team a grid mix to that electricity, and we'll be looking at forecasts and projections for a decarbonised electrical grid on a downward trajectory, and prorating that out over the 50 years to encapsulate the total embodied carbon associated with the use of the building over its 50-year. So the next phase then is the end of life phase. So we've got deconstruction, we have got transportation, waste processing and disposal. And all of these 4 stages factor into the life cycle global warming potential calculation. There is a further stage, which is module D, which is benefits and loads beyond the system boundary. It is a mandatory reporting, but it doesn't feed into the actual calculation itself for the total embodied carbon. So what are the units? So the units are kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared of useful floor area. That's the value. And under the Kyoto Protocol, it identified 7 greenhouse gases, which are the most significant contributors to global warming. In particular, carbon dioxide, methane, nitric oxide being the most significant. And so in generating a environmental product declaration for your materials and your products, it assesses the impacts of all of these different greenhouse gases and converts it into kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which then allows for us to do a useful calculation or a meaningful calculation to establish the overall global warming calc for the building. So I've spoken there about the timelines for under the recast EPBD, and it's not falling due to or as a requirement till January of 2028. But there is a CAP action, climate action plan action, that makes it a requirement for publicly funded projects in Ireland, as of from the 1st of September of this year, that projects, non-residential projects in receipt of exchequer funding in excess of 10 million, and in the case of residential projects in receipt of exchequer funding in excess of 60 million, will be obligated to produce life cycle greenhouse gas emission assessments for their projects. And that requirement will reduce down come the 1st of June 2026 to 5 million in the case of non-residential buildings, and 30 million in the case of residential, or in the case of residential buildings. Okay, so next to look at the inputs and the data, and it's important that the data remain transparent and the results are comparable, and the calculations and data is available at an early stage of design. To that end, we engaged Ramble in conjunction with Jane Anderson to do a review basically of databases across Europe, various different EPD providers, databases, and the like. So they did a review of what is available across Europe in terms of EPD databases, how they were structured. They reviewed them in terms of the data quality. There were like 48 databases in total, of which 36 were shortlisted during a deeper dive into the quality. They looked at the Eco platform database, the EcoBadat, which is the German database, the EC3 database, which is a global database of building materials, and they compared the good and the bad, shall we say, of all of these different databases. Like the EC3 database has over 25,000 different products contained within it. The Eco platform has somewhere in the region of 19,000. And they looked at the structure of all of these under various different headings and categories for us, and came back to us with recommendations on how we should move forward as a country and how we should handle this. And the primary recommendation was that, well, look, if product-specific materials already are existing on existing databases, then we shouldn't be duplicating the work here in that regard. We should develop a set of criteria which would identify the suitability of the use of different database providers, which we will get onto in a later slide. But ultimately, the recommendation was that we generate a generic database of environmental product declarations that can be used at early design stage when product-specific information is not available. So the recommendation was not to include EPDs in our database. It was to have generic data sets for product. And to that end, they presented us with this following slide, which was the hierarchical approach as how to establish environmental impactors. So the first is there a sectoral Irish EPD available for particular products? So if you had, say, 3 or 4 EPDs available for, say, a block, that we could take those, review them, and that we could average those sectoral EPDs and produce a generic value for blocks that was suitable for use in the Irish context. So the hierarchical approach here on the left gives a defined methodology for the development of a generic data set in a hierarchical approach. So the second is, if there isn't Irish sectoral EPDs, then averaging. The third preference being bottom-up modeling, which is what is done to generate an EPD for product-specific material. And then, in the absence of there being sufficient data in an Irish context, well, then we go to the European context and we look to see what's done across Europe, and we take averages of the European EPDs that may be available for materials. So I said that we wouldn't have product-specific EPDs, but they did advise us on a mechanism by which we can accept product-specific EPDs, and in particular, databases or EPD database providers who have EPDs for product-specific materials. Not all databases across Europe conform with this. This is simply we'll take the Eco platform database because it does. So Eco platform houses a number of different EPD providers' data, like EPD Ireland, for argument's sake, have their data set up on the Eco platform. An Eco platform carry out an auditing process. They check that program operators comply with EN 15804, that they comply with ISO 1425 for EPD verified competences. They comply with 14025 again for independent verification, and they do not accept the use of mass balancing credit approach. And if a program operator can satisfy SEAI that they have all of these measures in place, well then EPDs contained and housed within those program operators would be deemed suitable for introduction and use in the Irish life cycle calculation submissions. So this is a sort of an overview of the combination of where data can be introduced into the calculation. So on the left, the initial early design stages were going to be reliant upon the generic data. Then as we go through the design of the building and we trundle on to tender stage and construction stage, and we know more information about actual products used within the project itself, then it can be supplemented out that the generic data can be removed and actual product specific information introduced. So just to move on to the calculation methodology then. So as I said earlier, we have new buildings in excess of 1,000 square meters for 2028. Limit values to be set by 2030, and that's all for all new buildings by then as well. So we need a common, transparent, and I think transparent is the important word here, calculation methodology, something that is readily audited by anybody, basically. So at all stages, there needs to be clarity on the inputs, what's been included, what hasn't been included in the calculation approach. As part of our development of our methodology, we refer to several different publications, the RICS manual being one, I/E manual, and various different articles to take the best of all of these documents in conjunction with recommendations made by the RPS-RKD consortium and RAMBLE. And we basically started off, I suppose there was pioneering work done in the country by the Irish Green Building Council on the Indicate project. And we sort of built upon that work, complementing it with probably more robust or developed, I suppose, approaches outlined in the RICS manuals and the I/E manuals. So our approach has been over the last while, the mantra is to simplify, but be inclusive and be transparent throughout the calculation process. And so just to roll forward here, like in essence, the calculation is quantity of materials by indicators to give the building life cycle analysis. The use of sorry, just go back there. So it's important that we have the figures in the national database at an early stage that will allow practitioners to do a first pass assessment of their projects so that they can do a comparative between different potential schemes. So in terms of structure, say, if it's comparing like a reinforced concrete scheme to a steel decked solution versus a steel decked, or sorry, a hollow core solution, to inform the design team at an early conceptual stage as to what scheme will arrive at the lowest embodied carbon from an early conceptual stage, you know. So in our methodology, we have outlined approaches on how to handle each module to the best of our ability. To that end, we could take just one particular module, which is the A4 module on transport, and we sort of came down on the RICS approach based on the recommendations from RPS-RKD, which takes transportation carbon factors multiplied by transportation distance, but also includes a factor for the empty returning factor of the materials, the return journey of the trucks, and the materials mass to give the embodied carbon emissions associated with the transportation of materials to site. And so, as we said, we took the best of what we could find out there in the market, and we did a position paper on this, and we looked at the transportation modules contained within the RICS manual, and we sort of plotted them on a map of Ireland. And on the left, this was the the 4 transportation options that are available in the RICS manual, and we felt that we would add an additional module in here to give better coverage to the Irish market. Now, this is just transportation by road. The manual, our global warming calculation manual, also has transportation by sea and from Europe. There's 2 additional modules. So there's 7 different default transportation scenarios available for an initial pass, and they would be assigned in the database of generic building materials. We will assign them to the material types. So that will be an automated process in terms of selection of transportation of materials to site. As we refine the calculation towards a final result, and we have information available from the contractor, that detail can be supplemented out by actual transportation modules and distances, but again, applying the same factors that we will have arrived at in our calculation manual. So currently, we have just in the process of reviewing a further engagement of consultants to generate the generic database, and those consultants are that review process is ongoing at the moment, and it's anticipated that we will hopefully be appointing somebody in the next week or 2 to produce a generic database for the country. Another ask is that currently the EPA produce CO2 emission factors for various different fuels, both liquid, solid fuels, and electricity. However, these values only account for the CO2 emissions associated with the combustion of those materials at that source, and they don't include factors for well to tank in totality. So to that end, we have a second RFQ which is published to engage consultants to assist us and generate values. These are key values that will be applied to the module B6, the operational energy use, and will account for all upstream embodied carbon emissions. So I think the important thing is transparency is key to the calculation methodology. We need to know what's in the calculation, what's out of the calculation, how things have been approached by practitioners. We are, the requirement, the CAP action requirement for September of this year is very important. It will start to develop a resource of calculations that will be hugely beneficial to us in seeing and refining the methodology. Also, it'll help to benchmark different building typologies as well, and generate a necessary library of information that we currently don't have, which will assist hugely in the task of setting limit values for different building typologies, albeit that that's not required until 2030. But nonetheless, there's a deficiency of raw data and out there at this moment in time to inform us as to where to go. So we need to collate all that and go forward with that. So just to summarize, I suppose the key messages of the presentation. So it's like the life cycle global warming potential, a new requirement, Article 7.2 of the recast EPBD, including both operational and embodied emissions over the totality of the life cycle of the building. We need to notify the European Commission of a roadmap. This will outline how it is we are going to arrive at setting limit values by 2030. It won't be informing the Commission of limit values, but rather the roadmap. And that needs to be done by January 2027. We will be required to publish these values for all buildings in excess of 1,000 square meters, all new buildings by January 28, and for all new buildings by January 2030, with limit values set for 2030 as well. I mentioned that we have a public consultation ongoing at the moment. It's available on the SEAI website. Its closing date is for the 30th of May 2025. We'd welcome and encourage people to visit the public consultation page, download the documents, and we welcome any submissions at all that will help further development, I suppose, of this calculation methodology approach going forward. Maybe just about on time, Liz, am I?
That's lovely. Thanks so much, Gary.
We do just reiterate, we really welcome and would encourage people to download the documents, review them, and come back with some comments and suggestions. You know, we tend to collate all those, and we will publish then the findings of that consultation process on our website as well. Thanks.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thanks so much, Gary. But in the meantime, I'm going to now introduce Eoin Hallissey. He's going to be looking at the green finance readiness, aligning design with investment requirements. So Eoin is a sustainability consultant with a background in finance, specializing in ESG strategy, reporting, and finance, sustainable finance. As sustainability works, he advises clients across sectors, including the built environment. He previously worked in sustainable risk at Deloitte and in corporate banking at Bank of Ireland. Eoin also lectures for Chartered Accountants Ireland on sustainability strategy and reporting. His expertise helps link financial, regulatory, and policy frameworks with sustainability action in construction and design. So, Eoin, I'll let you take the stage there.
So, yeah, thanks for the introduction, Liz. As I said, my name's Eoin Hallissey. I work in Sustainability Works. We're kind of a multidisciplinary consultancy, we call ourselves, based out of Dublin mainly, but I'm actually here in Wicklow today. But we work across sustainability strategy, finance, communications, and reporting, which has been the real driver in the last year or two due to EU regulations, essentially. So today we're going to look at a few of the kind of trends and practical steps within the market where finance and design, and especially the design for performance concept, can kind of overlap. So we'll start off just by looking at a few of the kind of drivers for energy efficiency across the market, which we've seen, and how kind of finance comes into that. Look at it at the EU level, and then specifically, I think one of the main things we'll look at today is through the EU taxonomy, which is, as we'll see, the key kind of cornerstone of the EU sustainable finance agenda. Beyond the taxonomy, then we're just going to look at something you're probably quite familiar with, probably even more familiar with than I am, the Home Performance Index, and how that links into taxonomy, how it goes beyond that, and how it kind of meets the concept we're discussing today around design for performance. And then we'll finish off by just actually looking at how kind of financial products in the Irish market are working at the moment. So products and beyond just negotiating with your bank on a one-to-one basis. Start off with just the drivers we want to talk about. The first one, pretty obvious for energy efficiency, is the energy costs within the last number of years have risen massively. And then we look at, again, long-term asset values. And this is one that comes from, this one that investors definitely think about a lot, especially in the build-to-rent market, in that when we're looking at performance, the asset value over a long time it's kind of key within it. And with the increase in buildings regulations, A1, A2, BER ratings aren't going to stand out too much, I suppose, in the future when that becomes the standard. So we'll look at how we can meet basically increased valuations by improving beyond that. The regulations, as I mentioned there, have been driving energy efficiency across the built environment. Corporate customers, we've seen a big demand there. And then finally, banks and institutional investors, they are being mandated to report more and more on what they're investing in and what they're lending to in terms of sustainability. And they're also being incentivized in terms of finance, both from the bond market and from the European Central Bank, in terms of green bonds, for example, might have a discounted yield on them versus straight vanilla bonds. So they're increasingly looking for ways that they can invest and lend to green projects that can be proven to be green. And that's really driving, I think, a lot of the efficiency through in the market. And that was definitely the EU's intention anyway. So to move on to that now, the EU itself, just the sustainable finance policy, it's kind of come down the line from the Green Deal, which we spoke through today. And just looking at the context again, it's why is the EU focusing on sustainable finance? They have the need to drive private capital towards their policy objectives. It can't just depend on funding from, the European Investment Bank or other state bodies. There's the systemic financial risk from climate change in that if we've massive exposure to properties which are not adapted to the problems of climate change, or there's potential for asset stranding there, which means can cause severe losses on banks' balance sheets, which, as we all seen in the last 15 years, can cause bigger issues down the line, and also just securing sustainable economic growth. So kind of the key steps that have been taken is around transparency and disclosure. So in the financial sector and the real economy, there's been two kind of key regulations there and directives, although they're interlinked part of the policy. It's the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is purely for financial market participants, and the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which if you've been following that recently, there's been a pause put on that. The regulation was essentially intended to regularize and make common non-financial reporting on 1,000+ metrics across the environmental, social, and governance realm. So that was meant to encourage transparency. It would mean if you looked at two companies in the same industry, you could see how they perform, both in terms of their emissions, in terms of how they treat their staff, in terms of gender diversity, etc. But that has been a bit of a pause put on that, and the scope of who has to report on it's been pushed out a bit. And there is negotiations ongoing until we should get an update in October this year to see a bit of a simplification, see what metrics are still going to be tracked through that. And beyond that, the one we're going to talk about most today is the EU taxonomy, which is, as I said, it is essentially the cornerstone of sustainable finance in Europe, because it is the one process set up to define what is and isn't green, which has been, the big question in anything to do with sustainable finance in the last 10 years. We've seen a lot of things which people would call greenwashing, where you can call things green, but you're actually not proving if they are. So we'll see how the taxonomy kind of deals with that. The green bond label was released at the end of last year, I think, and that will, again, that's a classification of what can actually be called green. If you're lending to it through a bond, it needs to meet taxonomy standards. Then again, the overall agenda, even through these regulatory moves, the soft power piece was to just get sustainability onto the agenda of investors and banks. And it's definitely, compared to where we were 5 to 10 years ago, it's incomparable, the importance kind of put on it. And also just piece around kind of nudging the regulators to, on the national level, to consider the ESG and climate risk. And we've definitely seen that within Europe. Then just to kind of give a bit of a mapped overview of that, we have a nice slide here. It's actually from Allianz, and it's actually it's about, I think this slide's about 2 or 3 years old at this stage, but the point is that the actual EU Green Agenda, despite rollbacks in CSRD and that, still hasn't changed. They're still trying to reorient the capital flows towards sustainable investment, piece around managing financial risks. That's not going anywhere, and fostering transparency. But as we can see here, the regulations, they're all kind of interlinked. And just the one thing I'd want to say to take from this is to go straight back up to the top left corner there, is that a lot of them all feed back into the EU taxonomy. So the taxonomy is what we're going to talk about next. And again, it is the building block. It is the kind of cornerstone upon which all this sustainable finance is really based. So taxonomy itself, it's a classification system. So it's intended to provide developers, investors, policymakers, anyone in the market with kind of appropriate definitions and comparable definitions for what activities are actually sustainable. So from an investor's point of view, it's creating security for you that, you know, if I invest in an activity which has been called sustainable by the taxonomy, nobody's going to turn around in 2 years' time and tell me, actually, that does not qualify for your green fund anymore. So it creates certainty in the market, helps companies actually guide you on how to become more climate friendly, because it's so many prescriptive steps that tells you what you actually need to do. And most importantly, it should help shift investments kind of towards green activities where they're actually needed. So despite, you know, regulatory changes, despite some bit of change in what the scope of the taxonomy is going to be, still think it's going to be it's going to play a vital role essentially in helping both the EU and Ireland to scale up any sustainable investment, especially in kind of the built environment sector. So as we said, it's a classification tool. We'll see how you go through step by step to see what is actually green. It's a list of green economic activities. So there are certain sectors which have been defined as having potential green activities in them, and some which weren't included originally through probably political reasons, such as agriculture, which are possibly going to come in the next few years. It's a greenwashing prevention tool. It enables companies, as I said, to make more informed investments. But most importantly, what it isn't, it doesn't tell you what you can and can't invest in. So if you do complete a taxonomy aligned development, nobody's going to be told they have to invest in it on your behalf, but it's pushing them towards that. It's not just in financial language, and as we will see, we'll be again looking at the steps that we take in construction new building, and there's a lot of stuff in there where we see the need for, you know, engineering experience, etc., to actually classify what is green, because there's items in there that your accountants aren't going to understand. And then it is, especially, it's black and white. It's green or not green, no brown or neutral. You're either fully aligned with the taxonomy or you're not. If you don't meet even one piece within it, then you can't call your project taxonomy aligned. So that's probably where it slightly differs from some other certifications that we see, but that's kind of a key point there to take away, is that once you're either aligned with taxonomy or you are not. And one slightly controversial piece was around there was lobbying to include nuclear and gas as potentially green activities under taxonomy as a kind of a transition measure. So, but we won't kind of labor that point, as we're just talking about the built environment today. And then just two kind of, as I said, slightly contradictory things to add on the taxonomy. One is that around the recent EU proposals to water down sustainability reporting, there was a slight reduction in the scope of what companies are mandated to report under taxonomy. So whereas it would have previously been 250 plus employees, that's changed now, and there's a bit of a flux around it. There's also a piece where some companies will be, you can voluntarily report, which would be interesting to see how that plays out. There's a suggestion that some of the standards and some of the criteria you have to meet under it will be simplified. So some of the compliance requirements. And when we go through a worked example, I'll kind of point out one or two places where I think the simplification may come in. But again, that would be just purely speculation at this stage. I don't stand over it, anything I point out there. But I think more importantly is the fact that even since the EU Omnibus, which is called, the change in EU regulations, the policy regulations, the ECB has come out and they have highlighted that they do still see the taxonomy as kind of the default standard for green finance within Europe. As I said, the green bond standard was released at the end of last year. I think it was actually officially released New Year's Eve. And taxonomy alignment is still a key feature of what is considered green. It is the central feature of what is considered green. So if someone wants to release a green bond in the European market, or if someone wants to get funding from a bank which is linked to a bank's green bond issuance, the project will have to be taxonomy aligned. So we might see less companies being mandated to report on the alignment, but when we look at individual projects, and especially in the built environment, there's still really an incentive there to pursue taxonomy alignment, because the savings on the finance side of it will still be real, this will be massive. In terms of, again, just looking through what is the taxonomy again, just to highlight, it's the cornerstone of the framework, classification system. The market comparability piece is probably one that I haven't touched on enough. It's that if you're two companies within one industry are mandated to disclose the exact same information and provide a common language. It allows you to compare, as an investor, to compare two companies or two projects even. Scientific and technical language is used, as we will see. Doesn't contain every economic activity, but it is evolving. And then again, it doesn't tell you what you can and can't invest in, but essentially it's again that nudge piece to try and nudge investors towards that goal. So how does taxonomy work? Which is interesting. For the activity to be considered aligned, there's kind of three main criteria, as we'll see in a second. It's very prescriptive, technical for the most part. As I said, it's step-by-step prescriptive steps of what you must show to prove you are taxonomy aligned, and there's very little gray in it. It's yes and no. And then companies will have to translate their taxonomy aligned investments into their financial KPIs. So they will report what % of their revenue or their capex is taxonomy aligned, or financial institutions might report what % of, essentially simplified way of putting it, but essentially what % of their loan portfolio is taxonomy aligned. But again, we'll just try to stick to the practical steps of how you show your taxonomy aligned today. So first piece is you must show that you're making a substantial contribution to one of the 6 criteria. So again, any project will be kind of focused on one of these 6 criteria. So whether it's climate change mitigation, adaptation, water, marine resources, circular economy, pollution prevention, or protection of biodiversity. That's the first step. You must show that you're making a substantial contribution. And again, what a substantial contribution is very clearly defined, dependent on your business activity. Number 2, you have to do no significant harm to any of the other 5 criteria. So if my climate change mitigation activity is, polluting a waterway, then I'm out. I'm not taxonomy aligned. So you can't just build a building that meets the climate change mitigation criteria, but is actually causing harm in one of the other places. So that's a key part of it. And then there's the compliance with the minimum safeguards, which is around kind of human rights since the social side of it. And they're linked to kind of the UN guiding principles on business human rights and the ILO declarations. And that's one where people have definitely struggled in that to meet that standard, you really almost need to be completing human rights due diligence in your own business and kind of through your value chain. That is definitely one place where I would suspect there might be some simplification, because it was actually linked closely to the EU's corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which has been pushed back a bit. So the fact that we don't have mandatory reporting under the CSDDD, it's called the due diligence directive, definitely makes compliance with the minimum safeguards harder. So if there is going to be simplification, I would expect to see it there. But then that's the overview of how it works. But now we'll just go through a worked example of the actual construction of new buildings piece. So again, first up, we need to make this substantial contribution phase. And for climate change mitigation, there's 3 potential ways you can do that. For your energy performance on your energy performance certificate can be 10% less than near zero energy building requirements. So again, just showing that building regulations aren't the standard for sustainable finance here. We're kind of going beyond the base standards, and it's really clear that the EU has set higher standard regulations on purpose. So it's great that we're all meeting NZEB requirements, but NZEB -10 now, taxonomy is demanding that. So that's an interesting one. And that's, again, when we're looking at any residential developments, that's a standard that needs to be met. For larger buildings, I think it needs to be both air tightness and thermal integrity standards, and then the global warming potential needs to be calculated as well for each stage in the life cycle. And again, it needs to be disclosed clearly. So the most common one we have definitely seen is number 1, because I think a lot of the focus in the developments has been around kind of the housing market. So the energy performance piece is one that has come up a lot. But again, it's just showing that it's going beyond current environmental regulations. Green can't be the base standard. If you're going to be benefiting from being green, you're going to have to push beyond that. So it's interesting to see that they're trying to push the financial market that way. And the second stage is the do no significant harm, as we mentioned. And as we can see, you've now proven that your building, your house, your office block is going to make a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation, but you have to prove that you're not harming any of the other the other 6 criteria objectives. So in climate adaptation, you need to have carried out a physical climate risk through climate risk and vulnerability assessment, and it's really prescriptive of the steps you need to take within that. It needs to be, you need to consider your short, medium, and long-term risks within that. And again, any site would probably have to have that to prove their taxonomy aligned. When it comes to water, it's within the construction phase, but also there's pieces around the flow rate of your appliances within the buildings that you're building. So again, it'll be really, really well defined within the regulation. Circular economy, again, similar. It's around your waste protocol. It's around, you have to have, I think, 70% of waste has to be prepared for reuse, recycling, material recovery. So again, it's probably a good idea at the start, even to just map the actual requirements to the taxonomy requirements versus what you're doing already. Pollution prevention, again, really defined list of things that you can't be using or need to be managing. And then biodiversity, it's the first part is identifying anywhere where you need an environmental impact assessment and then putting in mitigating actions if that is required. And also no building near, in or adjacent to lands of recognized high biodiversity value. So again, they're just showing that you're not damaging any of the other criteria while meeting your climate mitigation objective. So, and again, then finally, and what we often see is that the minimum safeguards are taking that kind of an organizational level instead of assessing your policies and procedures for every single project in terms of how you're meeting the guiding principles on business and human rights around like areas of human rights, labor rights, and corruption, tax risk, anti-competition come in. So that can be assessed. The market standard has become assessing that at a organizational level as opposed to each project, because that's just not really feasible. But again, we might see a bit of simplification there, but it's definitely one to watch. So the next piece just around certification of taxonomy alignment. Question again at the start was, can we self-certify it? But I don't know many banks who will allow you to self-certify anything that they're giving you a margin discount for. Will existing frameworks be amended to enable the certification? There is definitely a lot of overlap between Brien and LEED and with the taxonomy, but even though the European Financial Regulation Advisory Group were asked directly on this, they have been kind of unclear in their answer on it. So there is, just because of the fact taxonomy is so black and white, they don't necessarily always map directly. And in terms of actual certification, there's one company, the DGMB in Germany, who have been carrying out certification across the board, and they're still in that space. Then, just to show that this is data from the EU released about June last year, so hopefully we'll get an update for this year shortly. But it just shows that in terms of taxonomy aligned investment across Europe, we've seen kind of 41 projects to 2023, which is it's definitely an area where we need a bit more growth. There's one of the main difficulties has been around gathering data, so that is definitely a challenge that a lot of people have. As you can imagine, looking at those requirements, they're pretty strict, but we'll be interested to see a bit of growth there. And even within the Irish market, we've seen the Linecore have announced that the glass bottle site, which then Ringsend they're going to be fully taxonomy aligned, with the aim of including that in green investment funds. So that's one kind of, I suppose, Irish example straight away where we've seen it in place. And just look at the Irish market beyond taxonomy. We've the purpose for today, I suppose, the design for performance, and you might have noticed that the taxonomy performance objectives, they're kind of solely focused on energy efficiency, along with that doing a significant harm piece. But we're just going to go a small bit through the Home Performance Index, which I'm sure many of you know about, developed by the Irish Green Building Council. So it's nationally tailored to Ireland, and it is aligned with the taxonomy. So those two things go hand in hand. You can meet your EU green financing goals. And I suppose it's for finance providers in Ireland, it does provide kind of a ready-made solution seeking third-party assurance that eligibility criteria for new green homes are being met. So that's kind of a key piece there, that it's ready-made out of the box, and that provides an option for the lenders and investors. And also it is a significant upgrade on NZEB, as we had before, taking into account things like health, well-being, and circular economy. Just even comparing it to the taxonomy, we can see that, within the taxonomy, we're just considering the fact that for the benefits to people is that they'll have lower utility bills, and maybe due to lower finance costs at the building stage, you might have less expenditure for discounted mortgage payment. But HPI is looking at your health as well beyond that, in terms of the performance of the building, less repairs, more durable homes, not just, so that's going to be important down the line. And again, with asset value, it's going to definitely increase asset value across the board there. And one last piece on the HPI is just around HPI linked financial products that we've seen. And this is kind of the most practical piece, I suppose, from today, in that I've kind of seen advisors and solicitors talking about seeing HPI being referenced as a marker within term sheets for new developments for loans. And the lending market is definitely still developing. There's been a lot of improvements in the last 2 to 3 years since I was last working as a lender. But back then, even target setting wasn't really considering factors such as materiality, whereas it was down to individual negotiations, and targets were set. But probably there wasn't necessarily materiality assessments carried out. They weren't necessarily in line with the sustainable loan principles. So that was the key part there, in that if you want your loan to be truly sustainable, you need to actually make sure that any linked targets within that are the most effective and the most impactful to do with your business. So the HPI has almost taken that step away from the market. It's created like, this is the most impactful metrics for this market. And we've seen that been adopted now in 2 products by AIB, have released a loan where you can get up to, I think, 10 basis points reduction on your interest margin if your design meets HPI standards as assessed by the Green Building Council. And again, even in terms of proving it throughout the development process, it's same as any kind of project monitor piece. At drawdown stage, you need to prove you're meeting that standard to actually still receive that discount. And then also the Home Building Finance Ireland, kind of semi-state body, are offering a discount of up to 0.5% on loans that are meeting the Home Performance Index. So again, monitoring surveyor at the drawdown process confirms this. So that's kind of 2 interesting products right there, which are kind of ready-made for the market. And then just before I finish up, Liz, just the key takeaways, just 4 takeaways from that piece today. Is just that, and you might have heard, blowback against sustainability and sustainable finance throughout Europe, but the fundamentals driving the market, they still remain unchanged. The EU taxonomy, I can't stress that enough, it will still be the cornerstone for sustainable finance within the EU. And personally, I think the HPI is offering green home labels specific for the Irish market. And again, beyond the demands of taxonomy, but if you can still prove that you're aligned with taxonomy, it meets all the needs at the European level. And I would expect to see also more kind of pre-packaged products emerge, like those 2 we've seen there, beyond just individually negotiating your metrics within individual term sheets every time you start a new deal. So thank you very much for your time on that. And back to you there, Liz.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eoin. As I say, 3 great presentations we've just had. So